What's up, legends? Chronos here, back again with part 5 of What If Deku Had Cell's abilities. Today, we're diving even deeper into how Deku would dominate the My Hero Academia world with his insane regeneration, adaptability, and raw destructive power. I appreciate you all for tuning in once more and for your continuous support. You guys are the real MVPs. A special shout out to Big Teddy G3498, the amazing author behind this epic collab. None of this would be possible without them. Now, sit back, relax, and let's jump right into the action. Chapter 29, Echo Hunter. Izuku crawled into his den after getting back from the mall and then police station. He took off his shirt and the hidden bulge at his side emerged to reveal the hilt and part of the blade from Stain. He held his newest trophy with shining eyes and examined his new prize. He was still upset that he could keep it all and had to think quickly to get this much, but he was glad he did so as he put the broken sword on 2 bone nails he made to hold it over his trophies. He was very aware of how many lives that sword had taken from his time with Gang Orca, and even more so from the scent of old blood on it. He preened at his growing collection and his latest battle in taking out a very dangerous villain. He thought of Gang Orca and immediately pulled his phone out to tell him about it. He messaged the hero and not a minute later he was calling. Izuku answered happily. "Izuku, what did you do? You fought Stain?" Gang Orca said immediately after he picked up. He sounded extremely alarmed and shouted the last part. "I did, and I beat him," he said proudly, with the same attitude as a child showing their parent that they made their bed by themselves. "What happened? Why? When?" Gang Orca stuttered through the phone. Izuku went on to tell the story of his class going shopping for camping supplies and then Shinami attacking him and then Stain arriving. "I did get really angry when Mina was hurt. After that, we fought and I beat him. Aizawa and Nem showed up right after," he finished. Gang was quiet for a long moment and Izuku heard him let out a long sigh. "Is everyone all right? Your mate? You're not hurt, are you?" Izuku smiled brilliantly. "Mina is okay now. I bit most of Shigezaki's hand off, and I think I broke a lot of bones in Stain's body. I'm fine, I can heal." "Who is Shigezaki?" the hero asked confused. "You know, that one villain that attacked us at the USJ and can turn what he touched to dust. It's Shigaraki Tamura." "Izuku," he said fondly. "Are you sure?" "I'm pretty sure I'm right," he chuckled on the other end of the phone. "I'm glad everything turned out all right and good job taking out one of the most wanted villains currently. It's getting late and a young pup needs their sleep." "Not a pup," Izuku grumbled. Gang Orca chucked again. "Good night, Izuku."
Night, Gong.
He smiled cheerily. With that, Izuku went under his furs and fell asleep soon after. His sleep was mostly calm, but he did dream of his mate getting more hurt than she did at the mall. He dreamed of Stain's mauled corpse at his hands with his mate dead nearby. He woke up earlier than usual and stayed awake in his furs, remembering the nightmares he had. It had been a long time since Izuku had had nightmares of any kind, and it was no surprise to him what the subject of them were. He comforted himself by the faint scent of Mina on his clothes and the reality that she was safe. He stayed there for a long time until he saw the sun beginning to shine into his den. His stomach grumbled at his need for a meal. He had used more energy than usual due to having to heal numerous cuts from Stain. He got up and stripped the shirt he had on to go on a hunt in his territory. It wasn't long before he was back at his den with a few smaller animals on skewers over the fire. He munched on them while thinking about how else he could shift his body. He hadn't had much of a chance to experiment since he was usually busy with school or spending time with his mate. He did enjoy the form he took when he battled against Kaken in the festival with more armor than usual, but his senses were limited due to his face being covered. He hummed in thought and ran through the possibilities. He had an array of senses he could choose from while being armored like before. He would most likely keep the scales since they were easy to move in and easy to replace if damaged. But how to see? Eyes would be a weakness and a sense of smell wouldn't work, especially in the city. That would leave touch and hearing. He would leave the taste sense out since it would be a secondary sense he could use like his sense of smell. Touch would require him to use some sort of fine hairs or tendrils to feel the area and air. Since his other senses would be dulled, the sensory input would be manageable. He tried it out by cutting off his other senses while seated and extending tendrils with higher sensitivity. Dozens of thin tendrils moved around as he tried to get a picture of the area around him. He stood and padded around the woods to test how well it would work. He found trouble when he tried to speed up and ran into a tree. The tendrils were too limited in the area they could cover, and having fine hairs wouldn't let him know where obstacles would be at. He grumbled as he healed the broken nose and retracted his tendrils. He switched to hearing, and it took him a moment to adjust. He knew many bats had a form of echolocation alongside some aquatic animals like dolphins and whales. He began to like the idea of using echolocation to move around. While his hearing was higher than average, it wouldn't be enough for his experiment. He needed something better, and with that, he headed to the library. He spent the morning and afternoon reading up on different types of animals and some quirks that enhance hearing to a superhuman degree. It was very quiet in the library since it was the weekend, so it gave Izuku a chance to experiment without any distractions. He began by mimicking a bat's hearing and tapping his finger on the table to hear the echo of the room. The more he got used to the sense, the more excited he got at the idea of using his hearing with his armored form. With his idea gaining traction, he began to combine the parts of the best animals with superior hearing. He added some from some people with unique quirks that added to his hearing. After a few hours, he succeeded. With his other senses cut off other than touch, he could hear his surroundings using a form of echolocation. He moved around the empty library with his finger tapping on shelves to hear. He smiled with giddiness at his newest sense. Wanting to see what it looks like, he extended a tendril to see his ear. His smile slipped when he saw it was a large fleshy hole, a large weakness. He hummed, and the sound helped him find his seat again at the table where his books were. He grew bone plating around his ears to add some protection, and his hearing shifted to something different. The plates of armor were angled to be open where he was facing, which caused his hearing to be more focused ahead of him. That gave him the idea of moving the plates of armor around his hearing with smaller tendrils to angle the echo of sound around him, while allowing the armor to close at a moment's notice to both shield his ears and mute the sound to avoid the damage of something loud. He did so, and he shifted the armor plate to the angle where the sound came from. It became more clear to hear what was around him. He added more armor plates with tendrils to close around his head that helped angle sound waves to give him an even clearer picture around him. With another extended tendril, he looked at himself to see what he looked like. His head was covered in armor plates that interlocked almost seamlessly. The only thing from his normal form were his horns, which he had grown to like. When he moved them to open his hearing, they moved in angles to redirect the sound to his ears. His sharp teeth were the only thing other than his ears were showing. Now, he truly looked like a monster, just like Mina liked to show him pictures of. He giggled in excitement at his new form and ran to the exit to test it out in the woods. He stopped and went back to his table to put away the books he had been reading. Asato's voice in the back of his head. To say the least, his newest form was a success. He could see with his echolocation as he sprinted through the woods. His armored form was a bit slower than his hunter's form, but it was a new way to fight. Using this form, he could have beaten Stain without his mate having to get hurt because he was hurt. He absorbed the scales to become more quiet and began a hunt for a meal. He jumped from tree to tree while using his echolocation. He stopped and listened, armored plates moving in different directions to find his prey. There were sounds in the woods, but not enough for his benefit. He made a rapid clicking sound from his throat that echoed through the trees. He snapped his head in one direction and found his prey. A badger was looking around in full alert from the clicking noise. The hunter positioned himself over the badger and clicked again to see. The badger tried to run at the sound, but the predator was already upon him. Izuku just finished the last bite of the badger when the communications device in his arm buzzed. He extracted it and pushed the button to answer. "Izuku, I hope I didn't catch you in a bad time." Nizu's voice came out cheerily. "Nope, just some experiments," Izuku's dozen voices said at once. "Oh, may I ask what kind?" Nizu asked curiously. There was a shuffling sound, and then Nem spoke. "Heya, Izuku. I figured you left your phone in your room, so I'm using Nizu's way to tell you that I've got your things from the mall."
"Okay, Nem.
"I'll be there in a second," Izuku said happily. "I'll be here in Nizu's office." The smile on Nem was able to be heard through the device. Izuku quickly cleaned up and headed over to the door he used to get to his room and into the school. He bounded through the empty hallways and up the stairs to Nizu's office. He stopped and knocked on the door. Nem answered with a brilliant smile at Izuku. He smiled back and his already messy hair was ruffled by her as he walked in. The bags Mina and he had at the mall were in a box to the side of the couch for him to take. They said that was everything. Did you get everything you needed? Nem asked. I think so, thanks Nem. He beamed. Of course, kiddo, she said with a warm smile. About those experiments, may I see what you have come up with? Nizu asked from his desk with fascination in his eyes. Sure, Izuku excitedly said, eager to show his newest development. He shifted his head and ears to what he had been working on. His head was covered in bone plating with his horns still there. He opened the armor around his ears and made the clicking noise he liked to move around. Echolocation, Izuku said proudly. He couldn't see their expressions, but he could smell the interest in Nizu. Quite marvelous. How well does it work? Nizu asked as he threw a small ball at Izuku. He easily tracked it in the air with the armor shifting. He caught it and held the ball in his hand. Really good. He made a clicking noise and set the ball back on Nizu's desk to show his ability to move around as well. What brought up this idea? Nem asked from behind. Izuku grew quiet for a moment and said, if I had more armor around my body, the Mina wouldn't have gotten hurt in trying to protect me. He shifted his head back to normal. Oh, sweetie. Nem pulled him into a hug and stroked his hair. You are still learning. You shouldn't have been in that situation to begin with. But it's good that you are learning and adapting well. Don't let yesterday get you down. Nem placed a kiss on the top of his head, one of his horns poking at her cheek. Izuku nodded and understood what she was saying. All right. Nem helped him with the box of bags to his room to prepare for the trip. She was a bit surprised to see the higher quality items, but smirked at remembering that Izuku had the school's credit card. She helped him pack everything he would need into a large duffel bag and set everything belonging to Mina to the side. Once done, Nem sat at Izuku's heavily reinforced desk chair. You want to take Ashido's stuff to her home? Izuku nodded and pulled his phone out to find a way to call her. After a few moments, he found the call button and hit it. It only rang a few seconds before the other line was picked up. Zuku? What's up? Mina's tone was cheerful as she spoke. Mina, I got your stuff that we left in the mall yesterday. Great. There was a pause and then she continued. I would ask you to come over now, but it's getting late. How about coming tomorrow morning? Izuku also looked out the window and saw it was nearing sunset. All right, I'll send you my address. She paused. Do you need help getting here? She asked tentatively and with just a bit of teasing. I can do it, Izuku said defensively. I got to Ruzo's house just fine on my own. He pouted, which caused Nem to hide a giggle. Mina hid nothing and laughed out loud. All right, but if you get lost you will have to pay up. Pay? Pay for what? More giggling. You'll see. All right, I'll see you tomorrow morning, kisses. Mina was heard kissing the speaker. Izuku smiled warmly at the phone and put it away after checking the address. He told Nem the plan for tomorrow morning. She was skeptical of letting him out of her sight after what happened the day before, and more especially because Izuku heavily injured the leader of the League of Villains. They would have a bigger reason to target him after that. Nem proposed that she drive him to her home and back just to set her mind at ease. Izuku agreed to her counterproposal with little argument on his side. After that, Izuku gave Nem a hug goodnight and went to his territory for a hunt before bed. He shifted his body to his newest form, which he named Echo Hunter. He left out the armor on his body since it was unnecessary at the moment and began his hunt by rapidly clicking to see his surroundings. Chapter 30, His Mate's Den. Izuku sat in the passenger seat with Nem driving to his mate's home. While he did trust Nem, he still felt uneasy every time he got in a car. She knew this and helped by distracting him by telling him stories of her youth or playing music that he enjoyed. It did help quite a bit, but he still fidgeted in the seat. It took less than an hour to arrive by car. Nem stopped in front of a modest home. It was slightly larger than Kaken's with the same sized yard. The two got out of the car and the front door opened at the same time to show Izuku's mate with an excited smile. Mina leapt right at him from the stairs without putting on any footwear. She gave Izuku a tight hug and then dragged him to the front door, leaving an amused Nem getting the bags. Izuku's here. Mina announced into the house. Miwa peeked around the corner of the kitchen and smiled warmly at Izuku. Don't be shy. Come on in. Dai was seated at the dining table with a newspaper and coffee. He looked Izuku up and down before giving him a nod. Izuku, he said in greeting before going back to reading. Nem walked up to the entrance of the home. Mina welcomed her in and Nem set the bags next to the couch. Nice home you've got here. Thank you, Miss Kiyama. Would you like a cup of tea or coffee? Miwa motioned to the dining table. Oh no, I just wanted to make sure Izuku got here safely. I got more paperwork back at the school to do. Nem politely declined. She turned to Izuku and ruffled his messy hair. Behave yourself and call me when you want to ride back. All right? Izuku nodded and hugged her. I will. Nem gave him a motherly smile and brushed his hair back before heading out the door to the car they arrived in. I'll see you later. With the door closed, Mina pulled Izuku further into the house. You eat yet? Mina asked. Yep. Izuku nodded with a smile. You sure? I can cook something up real quick if you like. Miwa offered. Leave the boy be, dear. Come and sit down. Dai had moved from the kitchen table to the living room couch. He patted one of the armchairs. Oh yes, we didn't get to talk much the day before, Miwa said excitedly. She pulled off her apron and moved next to her husband while pulling Izuku to the living room. Nah, why don't you put away your bags in the meantime? Mina saw the glimmer in her mother's eyes and was apprehensive to leave Izuku alone with her parents. You better not scare him off, she said with narrowed eyes as she picked up her bags and smiled warmly at Izuku. Be back in a minute. The feral boy let himself be pulled to the living room. Miwa sat on the couch and was planning to pull Izuku down with her, but he stopped and sat on the ground. The two adults gave him odd looks and he explained. I'm really heavy and I don't want to break your things. Pa! Dai snorted. How heavy can you be? You're tiny. Izuku shrugged and thought about his weight. I have a dense metal skeleton, compressed muscles, and lots of added mass to use for my quirk. So a lot. Yes, Miss Kiyama told us a little about that. Did you do all that to become a hero? Dai asked. You don't have to answer if you feel uncomfortable, Miwa said in a hurry. It's fine, I don't mind. I didn't think about heroes until I was like 13, I think. I was going to the library near my old den when a man dressed weirdly stopped me to ask me about school and remembered they were a thing. Then Toshi came and I joined him in the hero exam for fun. He beamed at the memory. As for why for all the improvements, I wanted to be the best hunter. He nodded with determination. Was it difficult? Being out in the woods for so long? Miwa asked delicately. It was at first. Izuku remembered back to his first years in the cave. It took me a while to learn how to make a fire and winter was hard. He thought about the cold morning in the cave moss. But then I got my quirk. It made a lot of things easier, like hunting and healing. He smiled again. Miwa looked saddened at his story and Dai continued for her. How did you find your quirk? He asked in curiosity. A wolf tried to eat me and I killed it when I was 7, I think, maybe 8. He shrugged and continued. I got hurt and passed out. When I woke up again, I was all healed. It took a while to figure out what my quirk did, but it's super fun to experiment and try new things. Dai looked surprised. You killed a wolf as a child? I did. I still have its skull back in my den, he said proudly. As they talked about Izuku's time in the woods, 2 pairs of eyes peeked around the couch. One head was above the other as they observed the stranger in their house talking with their parents. The two looked at each other in silent communication and then snuck up to the stranger at the same time, one around the couch and the other climbing over it. Izuku's ears twitched at the quiet noise of clothes behind him and turned his head. He stared at a young boy and girl around the age of 6. They were almost identical with pink skin and golden black eyes. They both had small nubs for horns beginning to grow on their heads. The only difference was that the girl had golden pupils with black sclera like Mina. The boy had black pupils with golden sclera. The twins froze in their steps and stared at Izuku. He stared back and tilted his head with a smile. You're Mina's siblings, the feral boy said with certainty. Miwa laughed warmly. Those are my youngest children, Kaori and Saori. She pointed at the boy as Kaori and Saori as the girl. The twins stared at Izuku with suspicious eyes. Are you Mina's boyfriend? Saori asked. I am, Izuku said proudly. Are you going to marry her? Kaori asked next. Kaori, Miwa said in admonishment. Maybe I'd like to. Izuku shrugged. But people get married when they're older, right? Izuku turned to the two adults who were surprised at his bluntness. Miwa was the first to break out of her shocked state and gave him a teasing smirk. How forward of you. What would Mina say if she heard you? She asked with a giggle. Internally, she was beginning to like the idea. Heard what? Mina came around the corner. Your boyfriend said he was going to marry you. Saori shouted and pointed at Izuku. Mina blushed furiously and clapped her hands over her cheeks to hide it. Izuku, you can't say stuff like that. Why not? Izuku asked with his head tilted. I would like to marry you and have a family, he said with such earnestly and a smile. Not now, of course. Nem said that's for after school is done. When we graduate, I think. Everyone looked from Izuku to Mina, whose blush was intensifying as he spoke. By the end of it, she couldn't handle it and ran further into the house to cool down. I have to use the bathroom, she called back. It was quiet for a brief moment before one of the twins spoke, with the other nodding at their question. Does that mean we can call you brother? Miwa and Dai gave each other significant looks as they tried to talk to each other without speaking. Miwa read her husband's expressions and got that he was unsure what to do at the moment. And from what Dai read on Miwa's face, she was thinking it wasn't such a bad idea. They focused back on the boy who caused a ruckus in the house unintentionally to see Saori seated in his lap and playing with Izuku's hand while Kaori was on his shoulders and using his horns as handholds. Izuku, for his part, was smiling happily at the children on him. Miwa smiled as well at seeing them get along, and then turned to her husband to make the "I told you so" motion at Izuku's interaction with the children. Dai rolled his eyes and looked at Izuku. So, Izuku, Dai began, and Izuku turned to him. Were you serious about your feelings for my daughter? Of course. But Nem said not to do anything that my mate wouldn't like, so it would be up to her. He said seriously. You're not shy to tell us so bluntly. Miwa grinned. Why would I be shy? Izuku tilted his head and Kaori tilted with his motion. Hey Zu, what's your quirk? Kaori leaned over his horns and looked upside down at him. I can change my body to do what I want. He beamed up at the boy. Like what? Saori asked on his lap. I grew my horns and changed my legs to be this way. He wiggled his paws for emphasis. The twins looked interested and asked for a demonstration. Show us. Izuku extended a tendril from his arm and it moved gently around. Cool, Kaori said loudly and leaned forward on his perch to see better. What else can you do? Saori asked. Izuku hesitated to show his quirk for the first time. At first, when he was around people again like his pack mates, he didn't understand that his appearance may be scary and his transformation caused some people to be uncomfortable. So, he was worried about how they would react to his full quirk. He didn't want to scare his mate's siblings. People tell me it's scary and I don't want to scare you too, Izuku said honestly. I don't get scared. Me neither, the twins declared, one right after the other. Visions, Joe. To be honest, we're a family that likes horror movies and the like, and they've been exposed to some movies that they shouldn't have. Miwa placated the worry written on Izuku's face. We can move to the backyard for more space. Come on. I'm a bit curious to see you up close. Dai encouraged. Before Izuku agreed, another voice came from the hallway. See what up close? A tall, older male copy of Mina was leaning against the wall in the hallway and watched Izuku curiously. He had pink hair tied into dreadlocks pushed to the side with horns that pointed straight up. They were similar to Izuku's but smaller. He had a lazy aura about him, but his eyes looked at Izuku carefully. Ah, Yashushi, this is Izuku, Mina's boyfriend. Miwa introduced her eldest child with a smile. Boyfriend? Huh? You don't look like much, he said lazily. Dai smiled and got up. Well, let's see. He was about to show us. Izuku shrugged and stood up with Kaori still on his shoulder and Saori clinging to him like a baby koala. He barely noticed the weight and helped Saori by putting his arm under her so she could sit comfortably. He followed Dai to the back sliding door to a fenced-off backyard. There was a good-sized tree that shaded the back corner with a small platform in the branches with a rope ladder hanging down from it. Miwa took Saori from his arm and Izuku picked up Kaori from his shoulder and set him down. Yasushi eyed Izuku with crossed arms and a bored expression while the twins looked on in anticipation. I can do a few things, should I just… Izuku waved to the open space in the backyard. They nodded and Izuku moved to the center of the yard. He took off his shirt and tossed it to the side. He shifted his body to his usual hunter's form with breaking bones and tearing flesh. He heard the Ishido's gasp as the gruesome transformation. He stretched like a cat and flexed his claws. He stood up at his full height from 167 centimeters to a little over 200 centimeters. Now, he loomed over the two taller men who claimed he was small. Wow! Kaori spoke first with his eyes sparking in awe of Izuku. He quickly ran up to the hunter with his twin a step behind. "You're so cool!" he shouted up at Izuku. Izuku smiled as best he could without lips, but his hum of pleasure was enough of an answer with his eyes crinkling into a smile. He crouched down so the children could see him closer. His bony tail with his usually razor-sharp tip was blunted just in case, and his claws were the same. "Thanks!" His dozen voices spooked the children, but they giggled and began to walk around the hunter. He felt Kaori immediately jump onto his back and then climb up to his shoulder again to regain his position. "Now I'm the tallest," he said with glee. The other three Ishidos approach Izuku after a moment and also examine him from up close. Izuku sat on the ground and Saori climbed onto his lap again with his tail wrapping around her to secure her position. She giggled at the appendage and began to trace her finger across the blunt edge. He changed his two fingers into tendrils and she began to braid them. "I gotta say, Izuku, you're terrifying," Dai admitted. "What are you guys doing? He's not a show pony or something," Mina shouted from the back door. "Relax, he didn't mind." "Did you?" Yasushi turned to Izuku. "I didn't mind." A dozen voices rumbled. He tilted his head and asked his mate, "Were you angry that I said those things earlier?" Miwa snatched Kaori off Izuku's shoulder and said to everyone, "Let's give them some privacy." The other Ishidos left Izuku and Mina alone in the backyard. He shifted back to normal and stayed seated on the grass. Mina blushed again at what was talking about. She looked like she was trying up the best way to explain, but Izuku spoke first. "We don't have to get married. I know Nem told me that sometimes dating doesn't work out and people separate. He didn't show it, but he was hoping for the opposite to happen." Mina rubbed at the base of her horns and let out a huff before sitting in front of Izuku. "Well, that's true, but I wasn't mad or anything. Just embarrassed that you would be so." She moved her hands as if that would help her find the words. "Eager to get married. I'm not saying I wouldn't, but not anytime soon." She finished quietly with a blush and looked away quickly. "I'm not eager. Just I know I would like to marry you someday if everything works well. I like everything about you and want to be your mate," he said, smiling at her. Mina played with her hands and had her head tilted down to hide a smile. "What do you like about me then?" "A lot. I like your eyes and smile. I like how you always try to make others smile. I like that you are colorful and full of energy all the time." "What else?" "Oh, I like how you give me hugs and how it makes me feel." He beamed at her darkening cheeks. Mina was covering her face with her hands again and moving side to side in embarrassment at the onslaught of compliments from her mate. "Okay, that's enough." Mina covered Izuku's face with her hand. She pouted at his bluntness but quickly broke out into a warm smile at knowing his true feelings about her. She removed her hand from his mouth and pulled him into a hug. "I'm happy to be your mate." Izuku held her just as tight and hummed in contentment at the contact. After that, they went inside to join the rest of her family around the living room. They all looked up at their entrance. Miwa grinned at the two and motioned them inside. The twins waited for their newest friend to join them, and the other two men watched Izuku with narrowed eyes. Dai shrugged and accepted it and went along with his wife's attitude towards Izuku. Yasushi played it off as if he didn't care and turned back to the television and the movie playing on it. Mina pulled Izuku inside and sat beside him on the floor. Izuku, not having watched any form of media in a long while, was drawn to the TV. Mina smiled at his shining eyes and dropped her head on his shoulder to watch with him. Saori quickly reclaimed her newest seat on Izuku's lap. Mina pouted at her sister and she turned back to stick her tongue out at her elder sibling. Miwa watched Izuku and her middle child with cooing at their young romance. She could tell it was more simplistic on Izuku's side, but she could see the care he has for Mina. Dai, for his part, watched Izuku to make sure he didn't do anything inappropriate in his presence. After all, what kind of father would he be if he didn't put the fear of God into the man who was dating his daughter? Chapter 31. New Territory. The rest of the break passed quickly after his trip to Mina's home. He enjoyed his time with his mate's family. It didn't take long until the trip to the summer camp came. He said his goodbyes to Nem and the rest of the staff that were present. He was given a big hug by Nem and a kiss on the top of his head before he followed Aizawa to the meeting location. He had eaten a big meal that morning and had cooked up some meat to eat on the trip, just in case. Izuku loaded his bag onto the bus's undercarriage and then sat next to Aizawa to wait for his pack mates. Bit by bit, they trickled in and joined Izuku. Most of them asked questions as to what had happened at the mall, and he happily told them about his near-death, as they called it. His mate joined him when there were about 3/4 of his pack mates there. She greeted him with a hug and then wandered off to join the rest of the girls to chat. Kaken arrived and immediately began to berate Izuku for getting attacked at the mall. They wrestled around until Aizawa got tired of their roughhousing and they separated with messy and grass-stained clothes. The blonde grumbled about the stains, but Izuku was used to stained clothes and didn't mind it. Toshi arrived soon after and greeted them and then gave Izuku a deadpan stare. What? Izuku tilted his head in confusion. You just had to pick a fight with the leader of the villain organization that attacked us, he stated after taking a sip of his coffee. He attacked me. Not my fault, Izuku said defensively and crossed his arms with a pout. Toshi shook his head with fondness. Almost gave me a heart attack the week before I turned 16. Izuku paused and processed that. It was your birthday? Why didn't you tell me? He almost shouted and gained the attention of almost everyone. Toshi reeled at the sudden loud noise and waved him off. I just never cared for celebrating my birthday, he finished with a shrug. Wait, people get gifts for birthdays, right? Izuku looked around frantically. Izuku, it's fine. Toshi tried to stop him, but the feral boy was already sprinting away with a sparkle in his eye. Ruzo, can you make something to cover this? He tried to think of the word and snapped his fingers. A sheath. Izuku extended a thick tendril with a blade at the end. Yairuzo was surprised at his sudden appearance before her and quickly made a synthetic leather sheath for the blade with straps to tie it against someone's leg. Here you go. But why? Izuku took the sheath and sat down in concentration at the blade before him. He made it about 15 centimeters long and as sharp as he could make it. He compressed as much metal as he could into the blade to make it as durable as he could and then made the tang of the blade and then removed it from his body. He looked up to the vice president of his pack and asked, "And some really strong glue, please?" Yairuzo nodded with a confused look on her face and gave him a small bottle of super glue that she liked. What's that for? Some of his other pack mates were watching Izuku curiously as he frantically worked. Gift! He didn't notice Toshi, who was approaching to try and stop him as Izuku got up and bolted to his territory. Izuku! Toshi shouted at his shrinking figure. He threw his hands up in the air and turned around. What happened? What did you say? Mina asked Toshi. We were talking and I mentioned my birthday that passed this week and then he ran off. Toshi explained and pointed at the distant woods that belonged to the feral boy. The class that heard gave him pats on the back for his birthday and asked him what he did to celebrate. He tried to wave their congratulations away with pink cheeks at the attention. Ah, that makes more sense, Yairuzo said in understanding. She smiled and looked at the woods. What does? Toshi asked. Nothing. Yairuzo looked away with a smirk. 5 minutes later, Aizawa approached his class and began. All right, get on, we dash. He stopped and looked for the feral child. Oh gods! Where is he? There he is! Sato pointed and everyone turned to see him coming out of the woods. Izuku was running on all fours and half shifted into his hunter's form to gain more speed. His hair was being blown back at his full speed and dirt clumps were being thrown up from his claws. He skidded to a stop close to his pack and shifted back. He ran up to his best friend and presented him with his gift. Happy birthday! In Izuku's hands was a sheathed knife with a fire-hardened wood hilt that was darkened from the fire in some places. The grip was smoothed out with a small thong set into the wood on one side. The sheath was a simple black synthetic leather with straps. Toshi carefully took it from his hands and pulled the blade out to see it was about half his forearm length. The metal was dull, but it was evident to see the sharpness of it. It was simple but as sturdy as he could make it. The tooth is from the badger we shared when we first ate together. And the wood should be pretty strong. Izuku didn't finish due to Toshi throwing himself at his friend and pulling him into a tight hug. "Thank you, Izuku," Toshi said with a wobbly voice. He let go after a moment and looked away while rubbing his eyes. Everyone in the pack smiled warmly at the interaction. Even the usually standoffish hero lets the interaction go on with a hit of fondness coming through his eyes. Toshi composed himself and turned to face the front again, but was blushing when he saw he was the center of attention once again. A teacher should confiscate that, but seeing as just about everyone here can do more damage to a person with their quirks, I'll leave it be, Aizawa said to Toshi, and he nodded in thanks for not taking away the first gift he hadn't received from his mother in 11 years. "All right, in you all go." He motioned to the bus. Everyone boarded the bus, and Izuku made sure no one was left behind. They got rolling as soon as everyone was seated. The feral child sitting next to Toshi. Mina was right behind them with Hagakure next to her. It was rowdy when the trip began, but it began to quiet down. Mina peeked over Izuku's seat and watched Toshi continue to explore every centimeter of his gift. "Hey Zu!" He turned and hummed a response. "What would you like for your birthday?" He hummed in thought, and the class listened in to his answer. "I don't know," he said slowly. "Wait, how old am I?" Everyone who heard winced slightly and was reminded of his past. "You're 15 and turned 16 on July 15th, Kaken said without his usual angry tone. "Nice. Mine is on the 30th. Mina shifted the mood away from Izuku's tragic past. She still embraced Izuku from behind without saying anything else. The conversation on the bus shifted to everyone sharing their birthdays and what they did on that day. The class arrived at an overlook of the forest where they would be training. Izuku had to remind himself of what Nem said to him before leaving. Mina saw his fidgeting and approached him with worry in her eyes. She slipped her arm into the crook of his elbow and began to talk to him about the time she went camping with her family. It helped Izuku greatly. Aizawa was talking with Toshi and helping him strap the blade to his leg. "Did you guys tell Izuku about this stop?" Toshi asked. Eraserhead nodded and stood up from his student's leg. "We did. The only time he has shown any kind of discomfort of the sort was when he rode as a passenger in a car, and this would have been too close to what had happened to him." Toshi felt at the newest addition to his wardrobe and nodded. "Thank you." He didn't mention what he was thanking his teacher for. Soon, a black sedan stopped in front of the group, and Izuku had his eyes drawn to the people who stepped out. "Those are fake ears and tails, right?" He sniffed the air again to confirm what he thought. One of the two women looked comically offended at the feral child's words. "What a spry set you've got yourself this year, Aizawa. There's something all right," he grumbled. "As you all can see, we are half of the wild pussycats." They finished with a pose that had a few missing members. "Mandalay and Pixie Bob at your service. They will be our hosts for the time here," Aizawa said. "From here you can see the camp we will be staying at." He locked onto Izuku's eyes and gave him a reassuring nod with softer eyes. Izuku gave a shaky nod back and picked up Mina in a princess carry, and then leapt off the railing with Mina screaming on the way down. There were many shouts of shock from his pack mates, but then they changed into screams of surprise as the cliff became a slope and they slid down to where the other two were. Izuku shot out tendrils from his back and used them to slow their fall to the earth. Pixie Bob looked confused at Aizawa. "Give them a few moments before you get started." She nodded at his unusual request. "What's going on?" Mandalay asked, looking down at the students. She found the one who leapt off first, and he was kneeling with the pink-haired one talking softly to him. "This isn't fucking funny," Mina shouted angrily up at the three adults. She had figured out what was going on with her mate pretty quickly when he was forcing himself to breathe in slowly. Izuku grabbed her wrist without looking up and drew her attention. "It's okay, Mina. They told me already. I just have to keep reminding myself, that is all." The rest of the class began to understand what was going on and also threw nasty glares at Aizawa, but calmed down quickly enough. "Just give me a minute." Mina nodded and knelt with him while holding his hand. Izuku focused on the sense of his pack and the surrounding forest. He reminded himself that he wasn't alone and he wasn't abandoned again. Soon, he heard the rest of his pack get close and stand near him. It only took a few minutes until Izuku was standing again and looking around at the new territory. He smiled thankfully to them all and they began to move to the camp. Suddenly, there was a rumble and then a dirt monster emerged from the earth. By the way, you all can use your quirks freely and don't worry. Those are my creations. Something to give you all a challenge. Pixie Bob shouted down at them. Koda was the first one to try and talk to the beast but was useless and Izuku pulled him back with a tendril while Kaken blasted it apart. It's made of dirt, Izuku observed while digging through its remains. How am I supposed to eat this? This isn't a hunt, Izuku said outraged. Izuku, you can't eat everything you fight, Toshi said placatingly. Internally, he was glad his friend was adapting quickly from his near panic attack. He can eat dirt if he wants. Who are you to tell him not to? Kaken argued and watched Izuku from the corner of his eye to see if he'd take the bait and eat dirt. Didn't you say you took a bite out of Shigaraki's hand? Kaminari asked. Well, yeah, but I didn't swallow it, Izuku said defensively. Do you have the taste of human flesh? Shiro asked with faux wariness. I might. Izuku narrowed his eyes at the black-haired boy, who was beginning to move behind the larger pack mate that was Sato. Sato grabbed Shiro and set him in front of himself in direct sight of Izuku to keep his focus on the tape dispenser. Alright, let's keep going before it gets dark. The strongest offense takes the point with Izuku navigating. Support and range behind them with anyone who needed a break to move to the back. Sound good. Yairuzo organized them and they all nodded. They began to move with Izuku already shifted into his hunter's form and disappeared into the trees. The group passed along already destroyed dirt golems. They heard the noise of battle and were beginning to get bored at not seeing any fighting. Kaken was the first to have an outburst. Izuku, get over here. He roared and made others near him jump away. The hunter appeared without a sound in front of them. He dropped from the trees and looked curiously at his old friend. Yes. He tilted his head like a puppy, but a dozen voices and a monstrous face with 4 eyes and interlocking teeth ruined the cute image. Yairuzo spoke before Kaken could shout something. Izuku, this is a training camp and you will tire out soon if you don't let us take some of the fight off of your hands. Just focus on leading us to camp, alright? She asked sweetly. Oh, sure. Izuku beamed and then disappeared with a shout. Follow the claw marks. The class looked at each other and shrugged. Soon the class was fighting the dirt golems instead of having a stroll through the woods. They were destroying them as they made their way deeper and deeper into the woods, following the clawed trees that faced them. Izuku was finding a path for his pack to follow when he stopped and sniffed the air again. He looked around to find what produced the scent on all 4s. He sniffed the ground until he found what he was looking for. A new scent that wasn't human or any animal he'd hunted before. He eagerly began to track the scent but stopped again at the sounds of fighting. His pack needed him to lead them to the camp. His neck snapped in the direction of the camp and then began to sprint as fast as he could while leaving marks for them to follow. Soon enough, he was looking at the camp they would be staying at for the training. He rumbled in excitement and then bolted off to find his newest prey. The hunter tracked the scent for a few miles deep into the woods and far away from any sort of civilization. He wasn't sure if he was still in the same territory that belonged to the pussycats, but he didn't care, he was hunting. The scent got stronger and he slowed his pace. He began to jump from tree to tree until he was above what he had been tracking for the past hour. A large brown furry mass was moving along and sniffing the ground. A bear. Izuku kept himself in check, but internally was hopping for joy at his find. He would be able to take another animal off his list to hunt. The hunter stayed silent and watched the brown bear for an opportune time. Just as he was going to leap at the bear, he stopped and heard 2 small sounds. His prey stopped being his prey when 2 small cubs ran to their mother. Izuku let out a keening whine at losing what could have been his prey. The bear turned around at the noise. It got up on its back legs and roared at those who threatened its young. Izuku could only sulk and glower at the bear's fortune. He would have continued his hunt if the cubs were older and could fend for themselves, but they were still small. Instead of wasting any more time, He leapt to another tree in search of more bears. It took him an hour to pick up another scent not belonging to the bear and its cubs. The only difference was that the new one was strong and close to where he had found the trail. He began by searching the immediate area where he got the scent. His ears picked up another sound, and he turned to see a brown mass leaping on him with a roar. The hunter acted quickly and moved to the side while swiping his clawed hand across its rear paw. It stumbled as it went past the hunter and toppled over. Izuku watched it carefully as it stood. It was a male at his glance, and it was bigger than the other bear he had found. Izuku made an excited noise that could only be described as terrifying to others. The injured bear roared in a challenge at the hunter and limped towards him as fast as he could. The hunter roared back and threw himself at the bear with claws and teeth. The bear had the same idea and clamped its jaw closed on Izuku's shoulder while his claws raked down his chest. The armor plate saved him from the worst injury, but his shirt was torn apart. Izuku's claws tore deeply into the bear's thick skin and drew gouts of blood to water the forest floor. The bear cried in pain just as Izuku did from the strong jaws latched onto his shoulder. The bear viciously threw its head back and forward, and the hunter tore deeply into the bear's abdomen. The hunter must have finally hit something vital in the bear's chest as it let go and roared one last time to the sky, and then it collapsed. Izuku roared in triumph to the surrounding woods. A new predator was lurking in their homes. Chapter 32. Camping. 19 tired and dirty students broke out of the tree line and found what the trail Izuku left for them. Aizawa, Pixie Bob, and Mandalay stood there waiting as everyone stumbled out with many collapsing in relief that the trek through the woods was done. Well done. It took you a few fewer hours than we thought. Pixie Bob exclaimed and was about to continue but paused and looked over them again. Wait, we're missing one. She looked slightly worried when she recounted twice and was still short a student. Aizawa's eyes sharpened and also agreed that one was missing and immediately identified it as the feral child. Where is Izuku? He looked at each one of his students. Toshi looked around the camp area in confusion. I figured he was here already. We had him scout the path ahead for us to follow, but we didn't see him after that, Yaoruzo said with worry about the class president. There was a rustling on the other side of the clearing, and everyone was startled to see a large brown mass emerge from the tree line with guttural growls coming from it. Holy hell! It's a bear! Kaminari exclaimed in surprise. There were bears in the woods? Hagakure shouted. Koda ran ahead and began to speak to it. Whoa, this isn't a good place for you to be in. It's someone else's territory. Please leave. He held his arms out in a placating manner but stepped back at the strong odor of blood. It's injured. With another growl, the bear was lifted and tossed on its side to reveal Izuku in his torn school uniform and covered in blood. I have brought nourishment for the pack, Izuku roared to the heavens. His usually green and black hair was streaked with red from having the field-dressed corpses drip on him. What the hell? Pixie Bob said in shock. You got a bear? Toshi shouted at his friend. You got a bear? Mina shouted in glee at her mate having gotten one of his goals. There are bears in the woods? Hagakure shouted again and looked in the tree line. Enough! Aizawa shouted over everyone and it got quiet. He rubbed his face with both hands and let out a long stream of air through his clenched teeth. Izuku, are you hurt? Not anymore. Izuku shrugged casually. Aizawa nodded along with that. We have food already prepared. We can have this for dinner tomorrow. He nodded to the massive adult brown bear. Izuku pouted at having to wait to dine on his prey. He looked down at it and sighed. K, he said with a long sigh. One more thing to do. Help Izuku put this guy away. Aizawa motioned to the bear and looked to his class. There were many groans, but they got to work with Sato stripping off his shirt again to help like he did before. Yaoruzo made a roll of wax paper and a simple table while Izuku hung the bear to skin it and cut it into manageable pieces. It didn't take more than a half hour with the help of his pack. While the kids dismembered the bear, Aizawa explained Izuku's more than unusual behavior to the other heroes. A small child watched in some fascination as the team took the bear apart but was distracted by the adults coming back from the talk with Aizawa. The two women were slightly red-eyed and Mandalay knelt to give Koda a tight hug without saying anything. He was worried as this was the way he was told his parents died, but Mandalay didn't say anything else but pull back and give him a sad smile. The final part of the bear was wrapped up and Shoji carried it off to the kitchen to place it in the walk-in fridge. The only part left was the skin which Izuku already had hung up away from the camp and the bear's head. He examined it and then took a bite of its cheek. "Izuku, that's not sanitary," Ruzo exclaimed. With his teeth still in the flesh, he bit down and chewed for a moment and then swallowed. He nodded at the taste and answered, "I can't get sick, at least I don't think so." He finished slowly and then took another bite. "He controls his cells. I'm sure he is the healthiest being on Earth," Toshi said, wiping his sweat-soaked hair back and sheathing his newly gifted knife after cleaning it of bear blood. "You should still wait for it to be cooked," Ruzo still argued. Izuku took another bite out of defiance while holding eye contact. She gave him an exasperated sigh and waved him off. "I'm too tired for this," and headed inside with the others to eat what the hosts had prepared for them. "How does it taste?" Mina walked beside her mate. "Tasty. Fatty and tasty. I like bear meat." Izuku had another bite before having his tendrils take the head away to strip it of flesh to have his new trophy cleaned. Mina smiled at his happiness. "I'm glad you got one," and bumped shoulder with him. "Come on, I'm hungry." She pulled him into the cafeteria where her classmates were already piling food onto their trays and sitting down. Izuku followed and had his newest clean trophy over his shoulder held by his tendrils. He piled food onto his tray and then had another filled with his tendrils holding the second tray. Everyone devoured their meals like Izuku usually did, and not one word was spoken until there were groans of satisfaction. When everyone was done with their meals, they were ordered to get cleaned up and then to sleep. Izuku mimicked the others as they rinsed in the shower and then followed them into a large area with a steaming pool in the center. Izuku walked around the pool apprehensively and watched the others slowly sink into the water with sighs of relief.
"This is Joe."
Toshi encouraged his suddenly skittish friend. "It's hot," Izuku stated and was crouched down by the pool and dipped his fingers into it. "It's called a natural hot spring. Just think of it as a hot shower." Shoji helped. "Hot shower." Everyone paused and then looked to Izuku. "Don't you have a shower in your room?" "Back to the school," Kaken asked. "Yeah, but I never take a hot shower." Izuku looked at his old friend like he was the weird one. Kaken just stared at him and shook his head. "Just get in." Izuku tentatively dipped his paw in and pulled it back while shaking off the water. He looked at everyone and they all gave him encouraging nods. He dunked his paw in and slowly stepped into the steaming water. Ever so slowly sunk to his abdomen, then his chest and finally to his neck. He hummed in pleasure. The other watched with some amusement as his face relaxed and he continued to sink into the hot spring. They grew concerned when he continued to sink until he was under the water completely. The steam just over the water obscured his figure so no one knew what he was doing. They all looked at each other and then they turned to Toshi, who was also staring at the spot where his friend sank into. "He should be fine," Toshi said slowly. "Most likely," he added on. A tendril emerged from the spot where Izuku had sunk. It expanded and grew thicker. From it, they could hear the sound of air being sucked in and out. "See, he's fine." Toshi relaxed in the water after seeing the tendril. Izuku sat at the bottom of the spring and was in complete euphoria as the hot water around him held him tightly. He felt that he could sleep where he was, but his airway was clogged. He grew a smaller tendril from the airway and poked at whatever covered his air. It was a finger, so he grew a small maw and nipped at the finger to go away. He saw who flinched under the water and retracted the airway to grab the leg of who he bit. He yanked him underwater as revenge, and it was Toshi who was glaring at his friend under his waterlogged hair. Izuku emerged from the water to hear laughter at Toshi's expense. Like an alligator, he bobbed in the water without emerging completely. "Kuda, I gotta ask, doesn't it bother you to have Izuku hunting? Like, aren't you close with animals?" Kaminari asked after he was done laughing. Everyone turned to the animal lover and blushed slightly at all the attention. He spoke clearly but quietly. "Not at all. It's the circle of life and Izuku is the predator. I've learned that when I was young, but I do warn any friends to stay clear of his territory." He finished with a chuckle. Izuku's eyes crinkled on the water's surface at hearing his pack mate speak about animals as he did. He emerged more and said, I never hurt them. A quick death to all of them. He paused and continued. Except for the bear, he took longer. Kuda nodded in thanks at his statement. All right, let's go before we prune up like old men, Sato said with a sigh and got up from the pool. The rest of the guys followed and got out. Izuku was one of the last and heard something odd. He looked up to see the young boy he had seen earlier in the day. Izuku waved at him with a smile, but the boy sneered at Izuku in return. The feral child was confused since this would be one of the first times he'd ever get that reaction, especially from a small child. Izuku frowned in confusion but let it go and began to make his way to the changing room with the others. When he arrived at the sleeping room, Izuku was uncertain as he saw every male packmate roll out their sleeping bags in one large room. To Izuku, it was odd since he had only ever slept alone and at most in a room by himself. Sharing a sleeping space was new to him. "Come on, Izuku," Toshi called over from his sleeping bag. "Just pick an open spot." He waved to the spot next to him. Izuku did so tentatively and copied what others did. He looked out the window high up in the room and asked, "Can't I just sleep outside?" "No way. This is part of the camping experience," Kaminari exclaimed. He waved him over to the circle of friends who were pulling out games. "Come over. I'll teach you some games," he said with a bright smile. Izuku did so and sat with Kaminari and the others as he learned the betrayal and deception of Uno. It was slow at first, but Izuku picked it up quickly enough that they were slapping cards down and cursing at each other. Toshi joined them after a couple of rounds. By the end of the night, 3 fights broke out, 2 crying young adults, and 1 furious dark shadow due to a smug Izuku playing +4s on him back to back when he was down to 2 cards. Aizawa barged in and glared at everyone until they scrambled to their beds. The feral boy had the hardest time trying to get to sleep in the unfamiliar environment, but soon focused on the thought that his pack was all around him and soon he was drifting off. The morning came and found 1A in front of Aizawa in the early morning. Many of Izuku's pack were still drowsy and nodding off while standing. "All right, you hellions," Aizawa began. "The reasoning behind the training camp is to expand on your quirk. While you gained knowledge and some experience during the year, here we are going to stretch your quirks to strengthen them." He tossed the same baseball at Izuku and he caught it. He looked at it and then at Aizawa. "Want me to throw it?" He sighed. "Yes, you feral child," he said with exasperation. Izuku shrugged and moved away for his pack mates. A long whip extended while holding the ball and Izuku's arm elongated with added muscle. The whip with the ball was dragged for a moment, then he whipped his whole body to the side, causing the whip to follow along his path. With a guttural growl, his arm flexed to the point his sleeve ripped and the whip shot forward. The whip cracked in the air and the ball was sent sailing through the air. Izuku covered his eyes from the sun and tried to track it but lost it in the blue sky. "You think that will hit someone?" Izuku asked, looking back at his pack mates and teacher. "Should have chosen some normal," Aizawa grumbled and turned to his class. "The point was that your quirks wouldn't have developed much since the beginning of the year, but Izuku keeps adapting and is unique," he finished while watching the whip retract into his arm and turn back to fingers. Aizawa split everyone up to work on their quirks. Toshi went with Ragdoll and had him use his quirk on her for complex commands. Izuku, for his part, stayed near his teacher to be sent off like the others. His ears perked and he turned to see a small rodent running in the tree line. He glanced over to see Aizawa still instructing the others in their tasks and he took his chance. Izuku bolted and his arm shot out with a needle-like spear that extended from his palm to kill his prey painlessly. Tendrils extended from his hand and quickly skinned and dressed the snack. Aizawa turned to speak to Izuku when he found him chewing on something. He narrowed his eyes at him and Izuku stopped chewing at being caught. Never mind. You'll be working on changing your body as fast as you can. From the smallest detail to the larger transformation." Izuku swallowed the mostly whole chipmunk and nodded. "That takes energy. What if I get tired and can't anymore? Then push a bit further and then rest and eat," Aizawa said. "Hunt?" Izuku asked eagerly. He huffed in amusement. "If you can manage." Later, anyone near Izuku's training area would think that the most gruesome horror movie was being filmed, as it was a constant noise of breaking bones and tearing flesh. He was continuously shifting his arms from claws to spears to whips and more. His body didn't change much, but more was added on, like scales, armor plates, and sometimes thick leathery skin. It was a continuously shifting horrific form to anyone who witnessed it. One such person saw his training and was thoroughly horrified at what she witnessed. "You all right, Setsuna?" Kodai asked from nearby her. "You got all pale." Satsuna reformed and smiled shakily at her friend. Yeah. Just saw some freaky stuff is all." "That freaky stuff is mine," Mina shouted as she glided by on low acidic acid and gave Setsuna the "I'm watching you" sign with her hand. Chapter 33. Fun in the Woods. By the end of the first day, everyone was dead tired, including Izuku. It was an experience he hadn't had very many times. When he was tired, he took a nap, stopped and rested, or went to eat to replenish his energy. But training his quirk so vigorously was exhausting to him. When they were told that they would be cooking up their food, Izuku nodded with acceptance and went over to a tree. "Suku, what are you doing?" his mate asked him as he walked away from the cooking station set up. The rest of the class looked over to see what their feral pack leader was up to. "Firewood," he said tiredly and slowly shifted his arm into a large axe head. Just as he was going to begin to chop the tree down, Kaken yelled out, "Izuku, there is already firewood." He pointed at the stack of wood to the side of the cooking station. He stopped mid-swing and looked over. He narrowed his eyes and pursed his lips. "Is it good firewood? Just get over here," Toshi said, turning back around to prepare on cooking the ingredients. The class got together to dull out the duties. Izuku watched everyone turn and begin their tasks. He never cooked anything other than raw meat, but he did know how to start a fire. So he did that. He created some sinew and grabbed 2 sticks to begin on the embers. With the practiced motion, the smoking tinder was added to the small sticks to start the fire. He turned to start on the next one but saw that they were already blazing. Todoroki shifted from foot to foot under Izuku's glare. "Cheater," Izuku mumbled. "Come on, Zu. Help me with this." Mina prodded him. He grumbled about taking shortcuts and cheaters but did as his mate asked. He wasn't sure what he was doing, but he followed her instructions and chopped the vegetables to her specifications and then the meat. He did pop 1 or 2 into his mouth when no one was watching, but he enjoyed the calm air with his pack. When she added the spices, his nose wrinkled, but he didn't say anything. He did notice she didn't put in as much as the others did, and he was grateful for that. Kaken poured the whole bottle of spices into his pot and was about to grab another when he was stopped by Kirishima, who was going to eat from the same pot. "Don't be such a pussy shit," Kaken argued. "Kaken, don't say bad words," Izuku admonished and then paused. "What does pussy mean?" He turned to his mate in confusion. Her cheeks darkened with a blush and she barked out a laugh. Izuku turned in confusion to his other packmates, and they were similarly in the same situation from his question. Kaken was one of the few not laughing but looking out into the distance as he was regretting his life up to that point. Ida was trying to rein them in and stop their uncouth behavior. "Is it bad? Like the other bad words?" Izuku began to feel mortified at saying a bad word. Mina began to calm down and leaned on his shoulder. It has the same meaning as some other words but more crude. It could mean scared or something else. She blushed slightly again at the end of her explanation. "Bad word. Got it." Izuku nodded and then turned back to Kaken. "Ima, tell Auntie Suki you're saying bad words again." "Huh? She says worse shit than me." He defended himself. Izuku looked horrified. "Auntie Suki? No, she doesn't." Before they could come to another bout of roughhousing, Kirishima stepped in. "Let's finish the food first." The food was filling and tasty to Izuku's senses. He did catch Mina adding salt to her bowl, but she didn't raise any complaints about it. Again, Izuku was content with the calm atmosphere with his pack around him and eating. There was a quiet noise of chatter and the woods making their noise, but to Izuku, it was peace. "You think he ate already?" Toshi asked from across the table. Izuku looked up from slurping his bowl of food to Toshi, where he pointed with his chin. He turned his eyes to see the small boy walking into the woods. He finished the remains of his bowl and swallowed. He shrugged. "Maybe. Should we ask?" Mina turned on her seat to Mandalay, who was at the door. "Hey, did Koda eat yet?" "Not yet." the hero said. Izuku stood up from the table and retracted the carapace legs that held his weight instead of the wood table. "I'll go take him some," he said with a smile. "Thank you, Kayama." Mandalay smiled at his offer. "Are you sure you'll be able to find him?" Izuku poured a sizable bowl and gave her a smug smile. "I'm the best hunter." Mandalay was reminded of the large bear the boy had brought and nodded. She watched him walk off with the bowl in hand and followed her nephew's trail. "Does he usually go hunt like he did before?" she asked into the eating group. "Every day." Mina giggled. "I'm pretty sure I saw him munching on something earlier too." Izuku followed the trail with ease. His footsteps were silent from the years of practice of walking in the woods. He never stepped anywhere he was sure that would make noise. Ducking under a branch, taking a larger step to avoid a patch of dry leaves, and stepping between sticks. That's how he was able to sneak up on Kota sitting on a rock outcropping without the boy ever noticing. Izuku stopped and took in the view before getting closer. He set the bowl to Kota's side, which caused a small clinking noise that alerted the young boy. He yelped in surprise at the form of a silent being with horns on his head. He began to fall off his seated position and into the drop, but Izuku grabbed him easily. "Get off of me! How'd you find me?" Kota pushed Izuku's hand off his shoulder and stood up with a glare. Izuku tilted his head at the anger the boy showed. "I'm good at following tracks. Here, your mom said you didn't eat. So food." He motioned to the bowl. Kota's face showed a brief moment of pain but glared again. "She's not my mom. And I don't want any of your crappy food. I think it tastes good." Izuku pouted slightly. "Where is your mom?" The same brief moment of pain flashed across Kota's face. "It's none of your business." Izuku caught the emotion on his face that time and his heart clenched at the reminder of his own mother. "Oh, I see. Was she nice?" Kota's eyes began to water, but he roughly wiped his face. "Why do you care? You're just some hero brat that's gonna go off and die like every other hero." His face was slightly red from the emotions surfacing. Izuku sat down and looked over the forest. "I'm just asking because my mother wasn't nice." He shrugged. "She's in jail or prison. I'm not sure what the difference is." Kota was thrown out of his anger by his words and asked out of curiosity. "Why? When I was about your age, I think she drove me far away. She did something to make me fall asleep, and when I woke, I was in the woods. Like these but bigger. She didn't like the idea of having a quirkless son, so she left me to die." Kota was horrified at what he was hearing. "But you're not quirkless. A few years later, a wolf tried to eat me. I killed it and found my quirk. It was easier to survive after that." He smiled at the memory of gaining his quirk and the turn in his life. Kota was quiet for a long moment and asked softly, "When did the heroes find you?" "They didn't, not really. I took the entrance exam with Toshi, and they made me a ward of the school." He smiled again and turned to the boy. "Was your mom nice?" He turned away and nodded sadly. "She was. That's good. You can always remember her being nice. I'm sorry she died, but Mandalay is nice too." "No?" Kota wiped his eyes again and nodded. "Yeah, she is." Izuku smiled at the boy who had a caring family to look after him. He patted the stone beside him. "Come eat, pup." Kota did so and picked up the bowl. He stared at it and then said, "There's no spoon." "Oh, I forgot about that here." Izuku extended a tendril to a nearby branch and sliced it off with ease. He cut it to the right size and began to carve away at the small log. Multiple tendrils came out and helped with the task until there was a simple wooden spoon in his hand. "There we go. Spoon." He offered it to the boy who watched the whole thing happen. Kota took the smooth spoon and dipped it into the bowl for a bite. "What was it like before?" he asked hesitantly. "Before I went to school? It was nice most of the time. Winter was cold, but I figured out a way to stay warm at night. First, it was hard. Took me a while to make a fire, so I ate raw fish for a couple of weeks. After I got my quirk, it was much easier since I could heal quickly, and I could change my body for what I needed." Izuku explained as the boy ate. Kota continued to listen as Izuku told him about his time isolated in the wilderness for his childhood. He had forgotten about heroes and villains and instead focused on the story of fighting to survive in the forest. Long after Kota finished his bowl and Izuku finished telling him about the time he almost started a forest fire, The two made their way back to the campsite. When they arrived, it was obvious that Mandalay was waiting for them to return. The kitchen area had already been cleaned up and everyone else had gone inside to clean up for the night. She didn't ask anything, but she could see the more relaxed posture of her nephew rather than the more recent frown and tense body. She was grateful for whatever the feral boy had done to help Koda. The rest of the class has already gone inside to clean up before bed. You should join them before it's too late, Mandalay said to Izuku. Izuku nodded and turned to Koda with a smile. Bye, pup. Koda nodded back and watched him go. When he was out of sight, he turned to Mandalay. Did his mom really leave him in the woods? He already believed the feral boy but wanted to see her response. Mandalay smiled sadly at her nephew and nodded. Come on, let's get you to bed too. She took the bowl and wooden spoon that she hadn't seen before. With another night of playing card games that ended with at least one fight between the guys, the morning came and brought another day of harsh quirk training. Izuku continued his training by shifting his body multiple times as fast as he could. When he tired out, he was sent to Tiger for the first time. Why are you doing that? Izuku asked the small group what required their body to use their quirks more effectively. To grow more muscles, but of course. Tiger shouted with enthusiasm. How else could you improve? That makes sense, but why am I here? Izuku asked. Tiger slowed in confusion. To do the same. He said it as if it was obvious. But I grow muscles every day I can. I don't do that. He waved at the others, mostly guys in 1B. Grow how? Tiger asked. You look like you've got muscles, but not that much. Kaibara-sen said. Sir Izuku is quite stronger than he appears, Shishida said, remembering his fight against Izuku during the sports festival. It's easier being small like this, but I compressed all my muscle fibers and continuously added more whenever I got the chance. See? Izuku explained and then had his flesh open on his bicep to show the red corded muscles hidden from view. Everyone slowed to a stop and some got green in the face at seeing the grotesque scene and the sound of tearing flesh. Izuku continued to explain his process of gaining muscle and his balance by reinforcing other vital parts like ligaments and tendons, while continuously healing any drastic wear on his joint cartilage to keep him in optimal condition for hunting. I think that's enough, Izuku. Tiger stopped him from continuing to explain an in-depth anatomy lesson. How about trying to strike me? Then, Tiger shouted with intensity. Izuku was thrown off kilter at the sudden request but did as he was told. His arm struck out to grab Tiger, but his body became like rubber and he bent unnaturally to avoid his grasping hand. Tiger countered by striking Izuku in the stomach, but it felt like he punched a brick wall. The other hand went to grab the offending limb, but Tiger pulled back just in time. Izuku didn't give up and continued to try and grab Tiger as he did his best to avoid the grasping hands. Why are you not using your quirk? Tiger asked as he frantically dodged each grasp. Izuku stopped and asked, Did you want me to? When Tiger nodded, Izuku obliged by shooting out a dozen tendrils from his forearms and shoulder as he continued to try and grab Tiger. When Tiger was grabbed by one tendril and then another, he did his best to slip out by compressing his limbs, but the tendrils tightened their grip, while more and more wrapped around him. Izuku tapped Tiger's nose with a victorious smile. I win! After that showing, Izuku was allowed to rest his quirk instead by having Toshi use his quirk on the feral boy. It gave Ragdoll a break even if she said she didn't need it. Toshi ordered his friend around to do more complex commands, such as putting together a puzzle which ended poorly since Izuku had not done a puzzle in ages. When he regained his stamina, Izuku went back to shifting his body as fast as he could between transformations. It was after a bear stew for dinner that things changed. Ragdoll brought them all together and announced a trial of courage. Of course, Izuku had no idea what that was, but with the excited expression from some of his pack mates, he looked forward to it. His mate excitedly explained to him the concept of the trial, but her face and demeanor dropped when Aizawa came to drag her away with the others who failed the practical exam. She clung to Izuku but was dragged away with longing in her eyes. Izuku felt bad for her. They were paired off as Class 1B were sent off into the trail they would walk through. Mandalay saw that Izuku would have ended up alone and decided to put him together with Ida and Kuda. She didn't want Izuku to experience something like the trial of courage alone, especially with his background. Not that she thought he would hurt anyone, but it would be more fun with friends. Izuku hopped from paw to paw in anticipation of starting the trial like his pack mates. His enhanced hearing did pick up their shrieks of fright easily, and he reminded himself that it was for fun and no one was in danger. Both Kuda and Ida smiled at Izuku's eager behavior. Izuku's smile dipped when he smelled the air and caught the whiff of burning wood. The smile dropped when he caught unfamiliar scents in the woods too. Scents of people not belonging to his pack, the heroes or 1B. Kuda noticed his change of behavior first, but wasn't able to ask him what was wrong before he was gone. Izuku's fist impacted against a large block that one of the villains was able to use to blunt the attack. He sent the villain to the ground and made her drop the item she used for her quirk. His knuckles reknit themselves back together as he turned to the next threat. A large sword made of other blades came down aiming to maim him, but it shattered to pieces when Izuku's shifted arm blade slashed upwards to counter it. Shuichi Iguchi, more recently known as Spinner, watched in disbelief as his weapon came apart before he got to use it. He stumbled back and got a good look at who he fought. He recognized Izuku Kayama as their target and the one who captured his idol, Stain. Before he could charge forward again to end the one who stopped Stain's goals, he froze. He began to shiver violently in pure terror at his mistake. The boy before him didn't change when the sudden fear came over him, but he wouldn't notice until later. What gave him nightmares was what came after. No longer a boy, changed. His body shifted and transformed into something terrible to his eyes and to his primal senses, death incarnate. For eyes stared at Spinner with the eyes of an apex predator. His claws scraped against each other while his tail clinked behind him and waved lazily. With his horns and interlocking teeth, his face was shadowed by his messy hair. He looked like a true demon in everyone's eyes. A dozen voices rumbled out, aimed at the scaled villain. Kneel. Spinner didn't hesitate and dropped to his knees while his body was racked with tremors. He didn't dare look up and accepted his fate was in the hunter's claws. The other villain was beginning to recover, but seeing what was before her, she stopped and cursed Shigaraki for sending them into a suicide mission. Chapter 34. The Hunter Hunts. The hunter stood over the two incapacitated villains as they were tied up by Mandalay and Tiger. The hunter was sniffing the air back and forth as he tried to decide where to go first. Two tendrils absent-mindedly stretched out and took a blade from the sword and a chunk of something from the other villain's tool. He ignored what the others were saying as he guessed at least 14 unknown entities near his pack or around them. He also caught the scent of something sweet that caused his nose to twitch. At least 14, including those two. The hunter said out loud. Everyone in the cleaning quieted, and Mandalay was first to speak in a panic. Koda is at his camp. Izuku she shouted out. But he was already gone after hearing the first word out of her mouth. Ida, run back to the camp and alert the others there, we are under attack, Tiger ordered. Ida nodded and sprinted off at full speed. Mandalay turned to Kuda after sending a message to the student to retreat to the campsite. Talk to as many critters to help however you can. Kuda nodded and shouted out to the forest for their help. Only one small squirrel came out, and it looked more skittish than normal. After Kuda spoke to it for a moment, Mandalay spoke with a frown. What's wrong? Kuda turned to her. They're all scared to leave their homes. I think it's Izuku, he said hesitantly. The hunter sprinted on all fours to where he knew where Koda was. He could smell the cub in his peaceful spot with another bloodstained smell. He doubled his speed and focused on his prey. He had to trust his pack to be strong enough to take care of themselves for the time being. The hunter broke out of the trees and found Koda backing away from a large blonde man raising his fist to strike the young boy. With a roar of challenge, the hunter launched himself off a tree with enough force to shatter the bark. The hunter collided with the man and rolled on the ground with him until they came to a stop. He aimed his clawed fingers at the villain's neck, but he was thrown off by hundreds of muscle strands emerging from his body. The hunter landed on his clawed feet and was crouched down with his tail whipping at the air in anger. You! How Lady Luck decided to bless me this day. You're on the list, but first, let's see how strong you really are. The blonde, muscular villain shouted. Koda stood in terror behind a beast and the monster who took away his parents. Koda, run. I will find you. He flinched at the dozen voices that came from the beast. He didn't hesitate and turned to run. "Get back here, brat!" The villain shouted after Kota as he began to run as fast as he could. The hunter intercepted the villain from leaping over him to get to the small child. With a roar of anger, he caught Muscular and began to claw at his chest as the hunter's tail whipped around and slashed where he could. Muscular punched down to get rid of the beast, but he was faster and crawled around to his back. The ground shook as they landed in a heap, but the hunter recovered faster. The beast leaped back onto Muscular back and tore at the thick layers of muscle. His spear-tipped tail cut deeply into the flesh, but no real damage was done. Muscular struggled to get him off his back until he got a hold of his tail. The hunter jammed his hands deep into Muscular's back as he was jerked to the side by his tail. He had the tail stabbed at the hand and he managed to show real blood. This spurred the hunter on and used his now freed tail to stab at the limbs. Muscular dropped to one knee from one particular spear to the leg. More and more blood came from the multiplying wounds until Muscular grew in rage and threw himself backward with all the speed he could to smash the hunter between the wall of flesh and the cliff wall. The hunter felt his spine break at the impact and he quickly repaired it before Muscular turned around, grabbed at him, and began punching repeatedly at the hunter. The small mountain began to crumble around them from each impact, but the hunter didn't give up. He used a tendril to stab at Muscular's neck. The villain reeled back at the sudden attack and then pain. The muscles protected him from the initial damage, but he felt something in between the muscle fibers. He frantically began to claw at his neck and reduced his quirk's effects around his neck to grab whatever was wriggling around his neck. It only made it worse since the parasite found an easier path to the real flesh. The hunter dislodged himself from the mountain wall and prowled around Muscular as he recreated the scene from the USJ. As he crawled around his prey, the accumulated wounds healed rapidly. Broken bones reconnected, flesh sealed, and bruised organs reformed. "Get this thing off of me!" Muscular shouted and continued to claw at his now exposed neck. The parasite burrowed into the villain's neck with little blood coming out of the entry wound. The hunter watched carefully as Muscular's body was racked with spasms before he fell onto his knees and then face down onto the ground. "What did you do?" Muscular screamed as he couldn't feel anything below his neck. He stopped grunting in effort at hearing the sound of claws scraping the rock. He was flipped over onto his back and he stared up at the four eyes of a beast. "You will never move again. You will never hurt anyone again. And instead, you will wither away like a rotting vegetable." Nem said, "It is bad to kill villains, so I didn't. I would argue you aren't a villain, but instead a monster." A dozen voices said softly over the prone villain's head. "What is this?" His eyes landed on the prosthetic eye. "Get away from me, you freak!" Muscular shouted and thrashed his head side to side as the claw came closer to his face. The hunter grabbed Muscular's face and held him still. "Mine!" and carefully yanked the prosthetic eye as Muscular screamed in pain at the sudden removal of his eye. "Good, stay here." He examined his newest trophy before it was added to his other trophies. He bolted off into the woods and caught the scent of the pup he was sent to protect. Izuku quickly found Kota hiding in a hollow tree trunk. He did shift back his voice and head so the pup wouldn't be more scared of him than he probably is at the moment. "Pup, I need to get you to safety." Kota looked up at Izuku. "Is he gone?" He stuttered out. "He won't hurt anyone anymore." Izuku smiled. "Is he dead?" Kota was now worried. "No, Nem said not to kill people unless it's necessary." Izuku grumbled the last part in a low voice. He got serious again and held his normal hand out to Kota. "I need to help my pack. Let's go." Kota nodded and climbed out of the hollow tree. Izuku didn't wait for him and pulled him onto his back and had tendrils hold him as he picked up speed in the woods. He heard Kota yelp in surprise, but Izuku didn't slow. It didn't take long for them to arrive at the campsite. What Izuku saw first was the villain Aizawa was fighting. With Kota on his back, he resorted to a ranged attack. Aizawa heard someone coming but had to focus on not getting immolated in blue flames. After dodging the next jet of flames, he heard something whip through the air. Looking up at the villain showed him clutching his neck as a tendril picked him up and slammed him violently into the earth. He exploded into a mud-like substance like the clone before. He turned to see Izuku with Kota on his back with wide eyes. Izuku ran over to Aizawa and held Kota to him. Take the pup. Aizawa immediately took him and grabbed Izuku's arm. You need to stay here. It's not safe. I'm not leaving my dash. He cut himself off and sniffed the air. He whipped his head up in the air to see two Nomu in the air. One flying and the other held in the talons of the first. Another one emerged from the dangling Nomu's chest like it was being born. The third smaller one emerged and grabbed onto the second Nomu as they continued to scan the area. They didn't see what made the flying Nomu's head explode, but they did see where it came from. The hunter roared in challenge at them after throwing the stone at the Nomu. The other two plummeted after the flying one let go in death. The hunter sprinted forward to meet them head-on. The second Nomu had thick skin with a single thick horn on its forehead. Its brain was exposed like every other Nomu. Its arms were thick and had 3 blunt fingers in each hand. Its legs were powerful stubby things meant for short charges. The third and smallest one had sharp claws with one large eye in the center of its head. The sharp, needle-like teeth looked menacing as they bared them at the hunter. Its limbs were thin and spider-like, meant for climbing and fast movement. Izuku! Aizawa shouted as he charged at the 2 remaining Nomu. He cursed under his breath and ran with Koda in his arms to the building to get him to safety. The hunter leapt into the plummeting Nomu and crashed into the ground. The hunter managed to claw at the horned Nomu's neck and gouts of blood spewed in every direction. The horned Nomu picked him up and slammed him into the ground with great strength. Then it threw the hunter back into the open grounds of the camp. He recovered quickly and looked around for his prey. He remembered there were 3 and looked around for the third. He felt the pain first and then heard the high-pitched screech. The smaller Nomu clawed his back as he wasn't looking. The hunter swiped at it, but it ran off as the horned Nomu came charging at the hunter. They crashed into one another again with tremendous force that the ground shook. The hunter stabbed into any joint the horned Nomu had to slow him down as the experiment did its best to grab the hunter to immobilize him for the smaller Nomu to cut apart. The hunter broke free from any grasping hands and shifted his hands into mantis shrimp claws. One solid hit later, the horned Nomu went flying into the tree line. It broke many trunks as it stopped. The hunter was made to focus again on the smaller Nomu as it leaped onto his back and tried to claw his neck open. He roared in pain and had his hands shift back to claws to tear the Nomu off his neck and hold it like an unruly child. But unlike a child, the Nomu thrashed around in his grasp and clawed at whatever it could. In frustration, the hunter grabbed it in both hands and pulled it apart. It screeched one last time before it was split into halves. He was just about to throw the dead Nomu away but was bulldozed and pierced from the back by the horned Nomu. The last remaining Nomu had recovered and snuck up on the hunter and gouged him with its horn that grew into something like a spear. The hunter screamed in pain and looked down at his chest. The horn had pierced where his heart was. This didn't stop the hunter as he slammed his elbow with so much force that the horn broke from the Nomu's head. A tendril snaked out his back and pulled the horn from his chest. The hole reknit itself closed. With the Nomu dazed from the elbow to the head, the hunter launched himself at the monster. He shifted his arm into a large blade and slashed it down where its shoulder was to disable it further. The Nomu reeled back and then lost the other arm in the same fashion. Aizawa ran back out after seeing the Nomu impale his student in the back. His heart clenched and his blood went cold at seeing the lethal injury he had sustained. He sprinted forward to help, but it seemed unnecessary as Izuku dismembered the Nomu and began to punch its head repeatedly until it was a mess of blood and gray mattress. With one final punch, Izuku stood in gore and roared in triumph. He picked up the horn that impaled him and had a tendril hold onto it. "Izuku, you need to get inside," Aizawa said just as the Mandalay, Tiger, Ida, and Kuda arrived back to their location. The 2 villains were tied up and dragged behind them. "My pack needs me," the hunter said in a dozen voices. His body shifted again and his head was covered by interlocking bone plates. Armor grew on his joints with vicious spines over them. His shoulders, knees, and elbows were covered with bone ridges that grew on his spine and covered the nape of his neck. "My God!" Tiger whispered in horror. "Where is Koda?" Mandalay asked, looking around frantically. "Pup is safe," a dozen voices answered, and he was gone after a rapid clicking noise that sent shivers down everyone's backs. Toga was having fun with Ochako and Tsuyu as they battled. She was excited to see the one who took Stain out, and more importantly, she wanted to see him covered in blood. It was too bad that she had not found the pink one she wanted. I gotta say, Ochako's blood tastes better, Toga said, licking the blade clean. Shut up, Uraraka shouted at the villain her age. She looked at Tsuyu, who was pinned to the tree, and then back at the girl who had just taken some of her blood with a syringe. Now, I just need to be dashed. Toga cut herself off and her eyes dilated like a cat. Tsuyu also stopped struggling and relaxed. Oh, he's here. That's good. What? Who's here? Uraraka asked her friend and kept an eye on the villain who had frozen up. She heard it then, a rapid clicking noise from the trees. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. Toga began to repeat over and over again as she dropped her knives and backed away from the two girls she had been playing around with. Tears cropped around her eyes, and she looked around at the sound that echoed between the trees. She turned to run but tripped on a root and sprawled on the ground. The hunter emerged from the treetops without a sound. First was his spear-tipped tail that hung down, and then he dropped down from a branch. Toga squeaked in horror and Crab walked away from him, but the tail struck out and wrapped around her leg. She continued to apologize as she was dragged back to the hunter, who stood tall over her. He grabbed her support item and tore it away from her neck. Next, he placed her on the ground and she fell to limp legs. Obey! A dozen voices ordered the shivering girl, and she nodded while looking down. He turned to his pack mates and patted their heads. Safe! He pulled the needle holding Tsuyu up. Back to camp is that way. Take her. The hunter grabbed her and grew something to cover her hands in metal. He grunted at his low store of fuel. I'm hungry. Toga flinched violently at hearing that, but peeked up to see the hunter gone without a noise. The two pack mates looked at each other and shrugged. You think Mina would share him? Tsuyu asked. Tsuyu! Uraraka shouted in embarrassment. Her face burned at the mere idea of it. I apologize, animal instincts. He is a strong male and you get the picture. Don't worry, I'm not a homewrecker, Tsuyu said, grabbing a catatonic toga and beginning to move in the direction they were told to go. The hunter weaved through trees to find his other packmates. He didn't stop to help Ojiro and Toshi as they were already running to the camp. He was happy to see them safe and continued on his path to help his packmates. The next pair he found was Shoji running as fast as he could away from a crashing sound behind him. He saw that Shoji had a missing arm, but he already knew he could regrow them like Izuku could. The hunter instead turned to the sound and found Dark Shadow had grown and was going on a rampage. The hunter dropped from the tree next to Shoji as he ran past him and faced Dark Shadow. Izuku, we have to go. Dark Shadow is out of control, Shoji yelled at his friend. Dark Shadow continued to throw trees left and right but froze after spotting the hunter before him. He felt like he was a child again with Fumikage as they stole cookies from the cookie jar and got caught. The effects of the apex predator and their pack leader being in their presence helped Dark Shadow calm down greatly. He had shrunk enough for Tokoyami to pull him further until Dark Shadow had his head bowed at the still hunter watching them carefully. I apologize, Izuku, Tokoyami said in gasping breaths. Dark Shadow nodded sullenly with his brother. The hunter got closer and patted their heads. You are safe, go that way. Shoji, go with them. He commanded and made to leave to find the other. Tokoyami was about to say something along the lines of it was too dangerous to go alone, but he saw the multiple trophies held to Izuku's back by tendrils and shut his beak. He bowed his head once again in thanks and was helped up by Shoji to make their journey back to camp. Chapter 35. The Hunter Protects. The hunter ran through the woods after making sure Tokoyami and Shoji were all right. He caught the scent of an unknown person up in the trees, but the scent was faint. They had moved on. He focused on the scent of Kaken and Todoroki he had grown to know. He could even hear them as flames shot up in the air with explosions next to the source. He picked up the pace and quickly found what they were fighting. A man in some weird clothes was dangling in the air by the teeth that extended from his mouth. To Izuku, it looked weird and off-putting. But that feeling didn't stop him from leaping full force at the villain attacking his packmates. Some teeth shot at him in an attempt to spear him, but the hunter swung his claws and they shattered in midair. The collision was violent as the hunter smashed his fist to the side of the villain's head as they landed. Multiple teeth speared through his chest at the same time. There was no way of dodging the attack when he was on top of the villain, so he took them head-on. He roared in pain, but he continued to strike at the villain until he went limp. He shattered the teeth from his mouth to free himself and began to pull the spears out of his chest. "Jesus! Izuku!" Kaken shouted in alarm at the sudden attack. He also was worried for his old friend because of the multiple lethal injuries he had sustained. For the second time that day, Izuku had to regrow his heart. His left lung was knitted close, his kidney reformed, and the punctured large intestinal line was fixed while ejecting the bile that leaked out from it. He growled in pain at everything while keeping his blood flowing manually as his heart took up the task again. He was very aware of the diminishing energy he had at the moment. He had to heal himself too many times that day, and the training from earlier that day depleted his stores even further. The dinner wasn't enough to put him back at full. But for his pack, he would continue. "Are you well?" Todoroki asked to his side with worry written across his usually stoic face. "I've healed. Get back to camp. I'll find the rest of the pack." A dozen voices intoned. "Like hell," Kaken argued immediately. "You will slow me down. I am from the woods. Go." Izuku turned to his old friend and pointed in the direction of the campsite. "He is right." Todoroki put a hand on the blonde's shoulder. "He is much faster and can track them down. We'll just slow him down." Kaken glared at the two of them and gave out an angry growl before nodding. "Don't die," he said to Izuku. Izuku nodded and turned to the nearest scent he could pick up. He was at least half a mile away when he saw the gout of flames that shot up in the air behind him. With his enhanced hearing, he heard Todoroki shout out. He pivoted back and ran as fast as he could back to his packmates. He picked up the scent of that person who was in the trees earlier and ran faster. He found Todoroki running in the wrong direction of the camp, alone. "Where is Kaken?" The hunter yelled and found where his old friend's scent disappeared. "A villain took him," Todoroki shouted back. "Go to camp." The hunter yelled behind him and quickly followed the scent of the villain. Compress leapt from tree to tree with ease as he ran to the rendezvous location. With one target captured, it would have to do. He had caught a glimpse of the second target, but he knew his limits and chose to go after the easier of the pair. He was just about there when he heard the thumping of rapid footfalls behind him. He looked over his shoulder to see a demon on his trail. With no eyes, horns on his head, and vicious teeth, it was the only word that could describe the beast behind him. The bloody, tattered clothes with long bony tail just added to his fear as he sped up to escape. He felt terror at each closing footfall of the beast, but he kept his focus on the clearing he was nearing. It was too late. He felt something wrap around his leg. The hunter yanked the tendril that held the villain's leg as he leaped into the clearing. He saw with his echolocation 2 other villains and one of his packmates hidden in the brush nearby. 2 others were prone near his packmate, but his focus was on the villain whom he pulled to his claws. His head shifted back to his hunter form so he would be able to see properly as he held the villain in the air by his neck. 2 tendrils held his arms out like he was about to ascend to the heavens, but the fear wafting off him showed differently. With the other clawed hand, he ripped away the villain's mask and hat to expose his face. "Where is he?" he roared in fury. The villain dropped a blue marble from his mouth. "There. Let me go," he said in terror. The hunter caught the marble with a tendril that split into smaller tendrils and examined it. His eyes went back to the villain. "Bring him back." He caught the movement of the other 2 villains, but his focus was on the one he held by the throat. "Let me go and I will," the villain shouted. He screamed in pain as his wrists began to be crushed in the grip of the tendrils. He looked into the beast's 4 eyes and saw the lashing tail behind him. "Bring his back or I will tear you limb from limb." The hunter's tendrils began to pull apart and continued to squeeze his prey. "Nem said not to kill. I will just make you suffer until you bring him back." His unoccupied hand shifted into burrowing parasites and began to move them to the villain's leg. Compress screamed in agony as both his shoulders were dislocated and did as he was ordered before the wriggling parasites got too close to his limb. "Okay." Kaken appeared from the blue marble disoriented, just as a purple portal opened behind the 2 waiting and horrified villains. The hunter threw the villain he was holding at one of the other villains, and they collided violently with cracking bones as they tumbled through the portal. The other villain was fast enough to dodge the body of his comrade and turn to the beast and the target he was supposed to capture. Instead of the villain retreating through the portal, he shot a stream of blue flames at the Kaken. The hunter saw this and pushed Kaken away with one arm as the other formed a shield of keratin. He felt immense pain as the exposed arm was immolated and part of his face was caught in the heat. The shield was able to block the rest, but the damage was done to the hunter. Dabi felt satisfaction at hearing the roar of pain but was distracted by a bright flash of light and a laser almost taking his head off. He turned to see who shot it but was drawn to his latest victim. Instead of seeing a dead body like he expected, he saw a blackened shield crumbling to nothing, and behind it was the beast with half of his face burned to the bone with an arm missing. The eye and skin from the top right of his head were gone and only metal bone and the horn were left. Instead of fear or panic like his victims had after surviving his fire, he saw hate. A dozen tendrils exploded from where the beast had an arm before and they whipped around in the air violently. Dabi began to retreat at the horrific scene, but not before the dozen tendrils acting as an arm grabbed a javelin that formed on his back and launched it at the villain. Dabi leapt through the portal backward in fear of the projectile. He felt shooting pain when instead of hitting his chest, it took his leg off at the knee. Jumping saved his life, but the terror stayed as he witnessed parasites devour the leg still on the ground that was taken from him as the portal closed. The hunter yelled in anger at the place where the villain had escaped. The hunter stood with an arm missing and his face regrowing his eye and skin that was burnt off. He turned and checked on Kaken to see if he was alright, and he was. The blonde boy was recovering quickly from the disorientation of being snatched up and transported via quirk and being close to being immolated right after being released. Izuku, are you alright? Kaken asked with worry written across his face as he watched his old friend's face heal. I have enough for my eye and face. Izuku spoke. Then he turned to Aoyama, who was peeking out of the brush. Are you all right? He smelled guilt coming from the usually flamboyant boy. I am. Aoyama nodded. I have two that need assistance. Izuku, your arm. Kaken still looked worriedly at him. Izuku looked down at the dozen tendrils that acted as a limb for the time being. I don't have enough resources to use to regrow my arm. Not enough iron, carbon, calcium, protein, and mass. He listed off as he thought of what he would need to regrow his arm. I will be fine. Izuku went over to Aoyama and grabbed the two students from 1B. I'll take these two. Go that way to follow me. Izuku pointed in a direction. Kaken nodded and Aoyama agreed. After that, Izuku carried the other two back to camp. They were tied to his back with tendrils as he rushed back to camp. It didn't take him long to arrive, and he saw most of his class had returned with many injured. Most of 1B was still missing. He set down the two he had brought back with the others that were being looked after. Hagakure, Jairu, and Yairuzo were all unconscious like most of 1B due to the gas, he was told. Izuku growled in frustration at seeing his packmates like that, but turned back to continue looking for the missing packmates of 1B. Aizawa let Izuku return to the forest to search for the rest of 1B. While he knew it was a bad idea to let a student do so, he was aware of how valuable Izuku was in this terrain. He also noticed how much his clothes were destroyed. He saw the torn-up shirt and cut-up shorts. He also noticed his arm wasn't what it should be, and he cursed himself for letting his students suffer as they were. The hunter ran back into the woods to find the rest for 1B. He caught the scent of a few he had passed as he looked. It didn't take him long to find a few unconscious being carried by other packmates back to camp. He helped them after quickly identifying himself as the pack leader of 1A. Who is that? Izuku asked 1B's pack leader. It's one of the villains. He was the one responsible for the gas that knocked everyone out. Kendo responded. Izuku growled at the young teen who cowered at the murderous glare he sent at him. You are lucky to breathe. Let's keep going, Kendo said to get them back on track to camp. Tetsutetsu was behind her as they made their way back to camp with Izuku carrying two others from 1B and the villain. They broke through the tree line and the other two let out sighs of relief at being back to relative safety. Izuku gently set the two unconscious packmates with the others and tossed the villain with the others that were tied up. Spinner had yet to speak or look up since he had been captured. Magna had tried to speak to him, but he was near catatonic, with Toga being in the same boat as him. She had tear stains down her cheeks but didn't speak. "One is missing." Izuku drew the attention of the others. "One of the cats, the nice one." Izuku didn't remember her name but knew her scent. "I found her blood but her trail ended, like the others when they went through a portal." He heard the cry of despair from Ragdoll's teammates. "Thank you, Izuku. Help is coming soon," Aizawa said to him. Izuku nodded and could fairly hear the sirens in the distance. That didn't stop him from wandering around the campground with his ears and eyes looking for any other threats. He wouldn't allow any more harm to come to his pack when they were at their weakest. He was also weaker, but he was the pack leader. He ignored the corpses of the two Nomu and the worried whispers from his pack. The hunter heard footsteps near him and turned to see his mate near him. "Izuku?" she asked worriedly. He butted his head against her side and she laughed softly before hugging his head that leaned on her side. "I'm tired," his stomach growled. "And hungry. Kaken said you got hurt badly." She pulled his head away to look at his arm, which was still a mass of intertwined tendrils acting as an arm. "Your arm. I can grow it back. But not now," Izuku grumbled. "You are not hurt." He looked over her to make sure. "I'm fine. Just worried for everyone is all." Mina smiled at him. He was seated but shifted to his hunter's form, putting him slightly shorter than Mina standing up. Izuku grunted in agreement and turned to the road to see dozens of ambulances and cop cars arrive. "They are here." Izuku relaxed a bit more at seeing help arrive for his pack. The paramedics began to organize and load up the unconscious students onto the ambulances while the police began to tie up the villains and load them onto the police van they dove in with. Any other smaller injuries were looked at and treated before moving on to the next student. Izuku kept one eye on all of them as they worked. Soon more people arrived. Heroes and firefighters arrived quickly after the police, but the heroes seemed unnecessary as all the villains and students had already been found and apprehended to their knowledge. Izuku corrected that. One villain is on a rock outcropping that way and another was left in the woods that way. "That one." Izuku pointed in the direction of the rock outcropping not visible from their location. "Is paralyzed from the neck down, and that one." Izuku pointed into the woods. "I hit him in the head a lot." Izuku shrugged as to say to the heroes, "Oh well, who were the villains? Are they known?" One hero asked Izuku. Izuku shrugged again and described them. One had lots of muscles that grew and the other had teeth that grew. "Muscular and moonfish?" One hero asked in horror. Izuku made an "I don't know" noise and shrugged again. "They had the scent of Shinami. They all do." He glared at the police van that still held the caught villains. The heroes looked at each other and back to Izuku, who had shifted back when he was asked to tell them what he had found. His arm was still composed of tendrils, but he had clean clothes on. "Who is Shinami?" "The one villain who tried to kill me at the mall and the USJ." Izuku said, exasperated. "You mean Shigaraki?" One hero asked, amused. "The villain with hands on his body and can turn things to dust. Shigatsu." Izuku nodded in confirmation. The heroes let him go and began to trek through the woods to find the two villains left in the woods. Izuku had specifically not mentioned his trophies still held by a few tendrils on his back, just in case they wanted to take them away as Nem did with Stain's sword. He remembered the bear skull and quickly ran inside the camp to get it. After that, everyone was on the bus to head to the hospital to make sure no one had any lingering injuries. Izuku sat next to his mate on the bus and almost immediately fell asleep due to exhaustion. And that's it for today's episode, Legends. If you enjoyed this, make sure to smash that like button, leave a comment below, and let me know what you think Deku should do next. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell so you won't miss the next part. Again, huge thanks to Big Teddy G3498 for the collab. You guys make this channel what it is, and I couldn't do it without you. See you in the next one. Peace out, Legends.